So hi, everybody. Welcome to the Board Pro Governance Made Easy webinar titled today, How Boards Can Govern M&A Processes to Prevent Destroying Shareholder Value. Let me just get this technology working a little bit better while I share my screen. See that, gentlemen? Fantastic. So my name's Sean McDonald. I'll be your moderator for the next 45 minutes. And firstly, thanks for coming along today. We always appreciate the effort you make to be here for our live events. During our sessions, if you have any question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering these during our session, and we'll try to get through as many of these as we have time for. And finally, if you have time, till the end of the presentation, and as is customary for our webinars, we've got a special treat for you. By answering our 1-minute survey at the end of the webinar and then following us on LinkedIn on our company page, you'll go into the draw to win a beautiful gift hamper worth over $500. We'll draw this later on today. Now, for those that are not too familiar with Board Pro, we're a board software provider, sometimes called a board portal, that serve around 20,000 users around the world. And we enable organizations to prepare for and run their board meetings more efficiently and effectively with clever software, less time, and deliver more impact and value for the organization. And as much as we are a board software provider, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints. And how we do that is through these webinars, along with the availability of many guides, templates, and white papers on our website. So you'll see on our website, the Governance Resource Center, this is where all of the governance templates, white papers, and guides are available to you to download free of charge. Let me now introduce our expert panel for today. We are really lucky to have 3 top guys with us today. Welcome, Dean. Dean Blomson is a highly experienced strategy and transformation advisor. He previously served as a consulting partner with several global consulting firms, including having developed and led EY's, which was then Capgemini's, strategy and transformation practice in Australia. And penultimately, he was a boomerang returnee to EY to their mergers and separations group, where he guided the one-day readiness and the post-day one delivery of major integrations and separations. Dean now operates his own independent strategic advisory business as a board director himself and a part-time professor at 2 respected business schools. Welcome to you, Dean.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Hugh Cottrell is a director at Direct Capital in New Zealand, market-leading and most experienced private company investor, having raised more than $1.7 billion for capital investments in 80 businesses across New Zealand and Australia. In his role at Direct Capital, Hugh is involved in sourcing and executing new investment opportunities and managing existing investments in portfolio companies. He is currently involved in board roles for Direct Capital Investments in Australia, AS Colour, and TR Group. Prior to Direct Capital, Hugh was a partner at Cameron Partners Investment Bank, where he acted for international and domestic companies on M&A transfers. Good afternoon to you, Hugh.
Thanks, Sean. G'day.
Steve Bowman, our good friend Stephen, is Managing Director of Conscious Governance and brings a great depth of experience facilitating board reviews and strategic planning processes. Stephen has held numerous senior executive, CEO, and board positions in the United States and Australia, as well as authoring and co-authoring over 14 books on governance, strategy, risk, and executive leadership. Welcome to you, Steve.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone.
Right, so I will hand over to Dean now to start the presentation.
Thank you, Sean, and hello, everyone. I'm delighted also to have 2 very skilled sort of wingmen tackle the topic with me, and Sean will direct us and direct the traffic, and we'll take questions, I think, as we go. Hey, Sean?
Indeed.
Yeah, so just some prefacing comments. firstly, this is a huge topic, and we're not going to land anything like a knockout blow on any particular aspect of it today. And so please bear with me. You could just spend a whole day just on cultural due diligence, a whole day on just transaction management, a whole day on financial due diligence, etc. That's the first comment. The second one is I respect that a number of you will have been through transactions, maybe even have led some transactions. You'll all have your own experience and war stories. Hopefully you're not too scarred by the experience, but we'd love to hear from you too as we go. I'm not the font of all wisdom on this. The third comment is I'm approaching this from the perspective of the acquirer, and particularly looking at acquisitions. Mergers have a particular definition to them, but we'll look at it from acquisitions where you're combining two entities and retaining the existing organization of the acquirer. And the last point is I'm also approaching this from the vantage point of boards, advisory boards. We're not going to take a dive into what executives and management specifically need to do, but of course you need oversight of what they're doing, and that's part of governance over transactions, not just enterprise governance or board governance, but governance over transactions so they're well managed. So those are my prefacing comments. Obviously, what I'm sharing with you is partly on research and partly on my own experience. So it's not just sort of homespun advice, there's evidence behind it. Here are the 5 key takeaways, and we'll go through each one quite quickly. We need to go at a fair clip. The first one is just to remind ourselves that this is a game of beating the odds. And I don't wish to be negative, but we need to just remind ourselves continuously. We'll talk about the factors that really matter. We'll talk about hard disciplines and soft skills. And the soft skills that are more likely to be the ones that will save you. Lastly, we'll talk about this as a real organizational capability. So look, firstly and upfront, you know, the reminder that is so important is that there is significant research, and I've just footnoted just a couple of examples, but I wanted to be at pains to make sure we all understood that this is not a trivial exercise. Even if you're making a small acquisition, they can be hugely disruptive and painful. And that really this is a game of beating the odds. And your task, or our task as directors, or sometimes as transactors, or sometimes as co-secs, if that's appropriate, is to continuously sanity check. Why do we think we are going to beat the odds here? And I don't wish to be negative, but it's important to keep reminding yourself of that. Now, of course, it's not all bad news. There are some wonderful stories of successful acquisitions that have changed the trajectory and the footprint of organizations. Done well, these can be completely transformative and very significant in terms of value creation. But it is still a task, and it is challenging, and there are all sorts of things that go wrong. We won't spend a lot of time going into those pathologies today, but please come back to this piece of bad news. It is about sanity checking. Why should we believe that we're going to beat the odds on this? Okay, thank you, Sean. We'll move on. So let's look at the 6 factors that significantly improve your chances of success as the acquirer. And maybe these will seem bleedingly obvious to you. And I think most boards would say, yes, we do that. But time and time again, it appears these are not done well or they're skipped. So the clear strategy up front, and I don't mean just the investment thesis over a particular transaction, but actually why are we deliberately going to grow through acquisition? What is driving it? Where do we want to do it? What's it all about? What is the profile, the look and feel of a perfect partner, et cetera, et cetera? What are the criteria that matter to us? That's a task up front. Not just sort of waltzing into your first transaction because the chairman was offered a soiree with another chairman and came back with a wonderful idea. The second one is that preparation and planning, and that really does start well before you get into the transaction. You know, if you use this as a sort of a crude analogy to a football team or a rugby team, you are carefully thinking through how you're going to build a great team, what sort of style of play you're going to have, how you're going to build up fitness, who's going to take on what roles, how's it all going to work. You don't want to do it through trial and error the first time you run onto the field for a big game. So that planning is about skills, capabilities, processes. It's about the advisors. It's about the style of transaction. It's about how you're going to lead this, etc. There's a lot of deep thinking that ought to go into that. Number 3, everybody says it, but few do it really, really well. Few do it with deliberateness, with depth, with evidence. And I'm not talking about sort of mouthing the words that culture is important to us. It is really, truly understanding the culture of the organization you're getting into. And of course, being clear-eyed about your own culture. And often that's a problem as well in of itself. The rigorous testing of the business cases, easily said, but often poorly done. There's often a sort of an overwhelming sense of optimism. Of course, the market's going to continuously perform. Of course, we're going to continually sell product. Of course, the synergies are going to come in the shape and form we expect, in the volume we expect, and at the time we expect. But that's not the way it all rolls, as we know. And you really need to spend a lot of time, even if you think you've got a worst case, it often isn't the worst case model. So,
Dean, can I just pop in there? One of the things that I've heard from other boards that have been through this and have done it very successfully is that they revisit their business case every year to look at the assumptions that they had and whether those assumptions still hold. And they do it for up to 6 years after the actual merger itself. So they actually look at the business case, the assumptions behind the business case, because often they find after year 1 or year 2, those assumptions have totally changed and they weren't what they thought they were. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a wonderful point, and I love what you've said there. The clarity with which you call out the assumptions and beliefs, and also the unknowns underpinning the detail of the transaction. The greater the clarity, the better the communication and understanding, the more likely you are to be at least informed. I love the suggestion that you go back to these regularly. Like any good strategy, you should be monitoring those beliefs, assumptions, unknowns all the time. Of course, there are too many organizations where once they've done the business case, they've finished the transaction. There's what I call a conspiracy of silence, right? Nobody wants to really talk about the war. They just want to get on and pretend perhaps that it was a wise decision, but without too much monitoring against the baseline intent. And, I think that's an opportunity lost, because each one of these things should be a learning experience, right?
Hugh, you have a comment?
Yeah, I just you did right, Steve. But of course, it's too late. You've already acquired it, and I think So, but revisiting it is a good idea. I mean, in our portfolio companies often, and we do. We update our game plan and we report to our investors quarterly. And it's amazing how often the game plan does change, and the things that you thought this is what we're going to focus on and this is how we think it can play out are different. And our success rate is a lot better than 50%, and it doesn't, and in my view, and everyone's got a different view here. Like some people say pick the industry, and other people say pick the people. For me, it's pick the people. If you pick the right people and get that culture right, your game plan will change, and the things that you thought would happen probably won't happen, but it'll be something else. And if you pick the right people, they'll pivot and they'll change, and you'll get it right eventually. So, but you pick the wrong people, and you'll have a world of pain.
I think the subtlety in this is that if the staff know that the business assumptions are going to be tested each year, they might spend just a little bit more time having a look at what those assumptions are, knowing full well that they're going to be held account to them for a period of time.
Yeah. I like it. Yeah.
I'm not sure if there's another question, Sean, but the last one, which we sort of really touched on now, is having that clarity of tracking against the value scorecard, what I call the value scorecard. We've gone into this transaction with an investment thesis that should be very clear, unequivocal, as we've just discussed. And if you've got that investment thesis, of course, it's going to mutate as you go along. New information is going to come through. You're going to have a couple of, oops, didn't see that kind of moments. Hopefully some serendipitous opportunities also come through, but you're running against that value scorecard. You have to, as a board director, keep coming back to that and being that painful person that says, ladies and gentlemen, just let's remind us, at this point, we thought we would have extracted this kind of value at this kind of a cost. How are we really going against that, Mr. or Mrs. CEO, Mr. or Mrs. CFO? It's really, really important. The last criteria I know sounds incredibly obvious, but it's that board that provides constructive challenge to each other. A lot of what happens around poor transactions are human failings, arrogance, belief, rushing the transaction, etc. And actually having a board that's prepared and willing to call it out, having that climate where you're expected to, and it's regarded as a safe challenge to do it, is absolutely critical. If there's a conspiracy of silence, it's never a good thing. So I think that's the key points that I would like to sort of call out in terms of the 6 findings. I don't know, Sean, whether there's any further conversation required, or we can bat on.
There's a question that's come in from David and Andrew. I'll read them out. David's asking, are there key metrics for post-acquisition monitoring? Who wants to tackle that? Hugh, do you want to tackle that, or Dean?
Yeah, well, I'll have it first. I mean, yeah, they will differ for every acquisition, for every business. But I think as part of your process going through, you should be formulating what those metrics are. So so here we formulate a game plan. So right, and we measure ourselves against that game plan across here are the key things across the different timeframes that we're going. So we measure ourselves against, on a quarterly basis against those specific things and against. So they're qualitative factors mostly, and then against the financial factors. So we have a dashboard essentially that we get tested on every quarter around how we're going against those.
My answer is somewhat similar but slightly different. It is context dependent, and I think the foundation for that should be the initial investment thesis. Why did we say we were going to do this? What were the benefits we were intending to accomplish? How did those frame up during the course of the due diligence? And then, of course, how did those frame up post-merger? And, of course, you've got to go back to those. We said we were going to extract these sorts of gains out of, harmonizing systems, out of simplifying processes, out of getting rid of, a second head office, in terms of taking people off the payroll or whatever those investment thesis elements were. You have to be explicit about that, as Steve was saying, and then you have to keep stitching back to that. Painful as that can be, uncomfortable as it can be, you've got to go back to that. What did we commit to the market? What did we commit to our shareholders and investors? But the synergy scorecard is crucial. And of course, the last thing around that is there are always these assumptions about how big those synergies are going to be, how much time it's going to take to achieve those, how much investment it's going to take to reap those benefits. And often those dimensions are quite wrong. It takes much longer to achieve and costs much more money, and the benefits are half of what you thought. So that's the benefit in tracking those KPIs.
Vikram has an observation and a question. He says, my observation is that the smart CEO takes this path, suggesting growth, as you suggested, as a diversion to business non-performance and takes credit if it works, or else he blames the acquisition issues. What's your take on this? Who wants to grab that one? Stephen, you're smiling.
Yeah, there's all sorts of mergers and acquisitions. Some of them where you've actually gone out and sought them, and some of them where government has said, "Hey, we've got too many players in this field. We want you to merge." And so, you'll find, in the health sector and aged care and a range of other different things where it's forced upon you. The key thing in there, I think, is if we take the 6 points that Dean has made and actually use that essentially as our criteria of how we monitor and measure how these things are going. And all of these are pretty powerful to actually help make something work really well. I think the biggest problem that people have is that the merger and the merger or acquisition is seen as an event, whereas in fact it's an ongoing business strategic monitoring and shaping and shifting as we go along. The thing with CEOs taking the credit if it all goes well and blaming the merger if it doesn't means that the board's not doing its job because they haven't shown the CEO the error of their ways.
Andrew has a comment I'll read out. Observation when cleaning up messes of M&A has shown that culture should be step number 2, which you've talked about, Stephen. Failure has been a mismatch in culture and nothing to do with anything else. Thoughts on that?
Can I reply?
Sure.
I Look, it's a huge factor, but I wouldn't say that you can sheet it all home. There's some transactions that have been rushed, and there've been all sorts of financial, legal, or other landmines. You look at Bayer and Monsanto as one example of that. So overestimating the synergies, many examples abound of that. The culture will always be a factor. If it's simply a bolt-on acquisition, in other words, in an unrelated space, and you're trying to get capability and you're bolting it on, well, you may go into this saying that we understand their culture and we're going to respect it and we're going to keep them at arm's length so we don't contaminate their culture with ours because we're trying to get this new capability. We're getting a data analytics crew or a innovation team or whatever it is, and we're going to not tamper. So we've understood their culture, but of course then sometimes people just say, yes, but let's put them on our same payment and incentive schemes or whatever it is. And you slowly start encroaching. So it's not always that you get the culture wrong going in. Maybe you've understood it very, very well, but you drift off what should be a wise integration strategy or management strategy. It's always a factor. It's not always the thing that undoes you.
Thanks. We have a question from Talat here, but we'll hold this till a little bit later on if you don't mind.
Sure. So now let's go into some of the hard disciplines and soft skills, if we can roll on for a moment, Sean. Thank you. All right, and I sort of tipped my hat at some of these things, but there are a whole bunch of what I call the 7 deadly sins, and these are behavioral things, the naivety. Well, how hard can this be? Or we just did a major SAP implementation. This is just another project. We're good at that. The arrogance, of course we can acquire these guys. They're a bunch of whatevers. We can do so much better than they can do. And of course, then we're paying a 30% control premium or whatever we're paying if it's in the private sector. You've got to believe you're 30% better than them and able to extract 30% more synergies than they could possibly get. And there's a lot of innate hubris or pride. There's a complacency. This can't be all that hard. We've got, years of experience. Of course, it's going to be fine. The undue haste. You've got to rush it. Or the converse of that, well, we've got plenty of time to extract the values. We'll just kind of, we'll just sort of monitor them. So we have to look very, very hard at our own innate tendencies. And often this isn't around the boardroom table. It could be the executive. And yes, the question earlier about CEOs, sometimes the CEOs are incented. The LTI is driven by revenues and maybe profit, but not by economic profit. Economic profit being, the size of the balance sheet and how much profit you're generating from that. So they're incented not to worry about capital efficiency. It all depends. So you've got to just watch those first 7 very clearly. Then, of course, we've got all the forms of bias at play. The sunken cost fallacy. That's why people get just sort of fixated on deal completion. Just a little bit more, just a little bit more. The value attribution. There's one guy or girl around the table who was a CFO or was an investment banker, has done lots of transactions, and people tend to defer to them. Confirmatory bias. Yes, I've been in that sector, and I think it's a great, et cetera, et cetera. There are a bunch of these pathologies, and you have to give them names. You have to be alert to them, and you've got to have a way of dealing with them. Now, there are ways of dealing with them, particularly on bigger transactions, and a number of you may have done this. You can have, risk review teams. You can do pre-mortems. You can have a red team review that's a mix of uncontaminated insiders and a bunch of outsiders who run the counterfactual over the transaction and do some of the things that Steve says, like really test the assumptions and beliefs, etc. These are all addressable, but you have to name them, you have to call them out, and you've got to be vigilant to them. No matter how you might pride yourself in being objective and making rational decisions, we know that behavioral economics tells us that we are not all that rational in our decision making, even as individuals or in the collective. And this is where you often get undone. So I'll stop at that point, Sean. I'm not sure if there are particular questions, but this is
Hugh,
about the soft side.
Hugh, did you want to jump in at this point?
Yeah, sure. I think Yeah, there's just like even in my experience, and I'll give you an example of the last investment that we didn't say yes to here. I was leading it, and I think you have this natural, if you bring something to the table where you're in private equity or a corporate, if you're bringing and saying we should look at this, and the firm goes, yes, right, let's dedicate resources. You are the leader, and you think so. You've got a natural bias there that you want it to succeed. So I think that just means, and is it overconfidence or just a natural aversion not to look at the downsides? And there are ways, there are definitely ways around it. And how did this one, and I was pushing this one internally, but ultimately two things, in it over your process. So we have a very rigorous process where we go back to an independent investment committee with 2 independent directors on it. One of them is, he's extreme. Both of them are very experienced, but he in the end just called me out quietly and said, but this is what you said back here. And I think it wasn't an issue with it. We were just ultimately overpaying. But I think there's just this natural, if you are leading something, you want it to succeed, whether you're leading that transaction or the CEO. So I think that just informs a natural bias to what you're doing. So, yeah, you've got to be vigilant against that. And just, I think, and not be arrogant to say, in fact, we say here, the best deals are the ones that we didn't do, that we've actually said no to. So yeah, I think there's just a natural human element here that you've got to hedge against somehow. So, and I think ultimately it's the independence and as going back to that great last slide we had around the 6-7 things, having a defined process will hedge you against a lot of that stuff. And early in my career, one of my bosses who became one of my partners said to me, the act of M&A can be opportunistic, but the rationale must be planned. So, your board should be sitting there going, right, what does it need to look like for us to go and say yes to something? So when it comes in and you look at it, you go, okay, well, here's the 4 things that we said it has to look like. Does it hit all 4 of them? And if it hits 1 or 2 out of 4, then it's probably automatically a no. So yeah. Again, I think that's a separate thing, but it's a planning and a process thing.
Yep.
Excellent.
I love, Sean, if I may comment, I love what Hugh has said, and I think it's that clarity of conversation right up front from the get-go. Where are we going to grow? How are we going to grow? What are the negotiable criteria? What are the non-negotiable criteria? And if you're halfway through this football game and you're starting to make it up, you're in a world of pain. If you start saying, well, let's just pay scrip and cash, and you said no, let's go back to our criteria. Non-negotiable, we were only going to pay scrip, or non-negotiable if this transaction, the target is greater than 50% of the size of our company, and there's plenty of evidence that says when the target is more than 50% of the size of the acquirer, you're dealing with something that's game changing, more momentum changing, and it brings an added layer of complexity. So tell me now, why Mr. or Mrs. CEO are we looking at a target that's greater than 50% of our value, et cetera, et cetera? You've got to keep going back to those criteria. And as you said, you have to spell them out up front. Otherwise, you just start slipping a bit more of this, a bit more of that. Anyway.
Dean, I was just going to
belabor the point. Yeah.
One of the cleverest ways that I found for organisations to address this is not just the logical traditional ways of actually doing a term sheet and having your war room set up and all that sort of stuff. But the cleverest way I've seen is where the 2 organisations, and I was involved in both setting it up and also suggesting to others they do it, 2 organisations that were looking at merging together actually do a joint strategy planning session for the merged entity. And even if they didn't merge, because they were in the same market, they wanted to create the same sort of thing. And what I found there is that it became very clear about whether or not they could actually then properly merge or acquire the other, because they had a shared strategic plan that got rid of a whole lot of rubbish. So if there are issues between the CEOs, guess what? That came up during the strategic planning. If there are issues between any of the directors, that came up as well too. And it's probably something for people to think about. If you're looking at a partner that you're looking to acquire, or you're looking at a partner where you're going to merge, maybe doing a pre-merger strategic plan can actually help keep people focused on why it's happening in the first place. It also addresses the question of before about how do you get staff involved in this? Because, if you've got a clear strategy that's going to create greater value out there to our communities, then that's what we talk to the staff about, and then the rest of it becomes transactional.
Well, that brings up this question from Talat here, so I'll jump in here. What are the key messages you want to send to the staff and management of the company you are acquiring pre and post acquisition? Also, key messages for your own staff. How do you keep them focused? Who wants to tackle that?
Should I go for it?
Yeah, go, Dean.
Right. All right, Steve, jump in if you'd like to. Look, it'll vary from transaction to transaction. I love Steve's suggestion. I think you can do that and should do that, particularly if you're dealing with not-for-profits. There is no reason why you shouldn't be doing it. And the beauty of what Steve has suggested, and I've experienced it too, is that both leadership teams and boards have now got a shared view about this beautiful new world that you can create together. And you haven't breached any ACCC issues by doing this, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a lovely way then to be consistently on message about what the promise is of that transaction if you both parties get it right. So it's a great thing to do. You can do it also. I've done it once with oil and gas business. We had to do it carefully, but it's a great way to shake out and get some consistency. The messaging to staff will vary from transaction to transaction, so to suppliers, so to regulators. But the one thing I would say, or two things, is be consistent. If you say to staff on both sides of the transactions, there's going to be no redundancies, you better make darn sure that you can fulfill that promise. Don't say it if you can't. And if you're likely to have to take people out, then, if you're going to be seen as trusted and ethical and fair dinkum, you have to say, we simply don't know, but there is a fair chance that duplicated positions could be reduced or something. But for heaven's sake, show integrity and show some courage in calling it out if you're going to say those sorts of things. Hard
and soft enablers, Dean.
Okay, so here's a mix of these things. And these are generic topics, but the leadership and governance, who's going to run the transaction, what is his or her decision-making rights, how they're going to interact with the board. There's a conversation that has to go back and forth to the board about what they're expecting from Steve if he's leading the integration, or from Hugh, etc. At what points are they going to be informed? You've got to shake that all out. On what topics do they expect to be informed, or which ones, is Steve not going to tell them what's happening because it doesn't matter? You need to have that adult conversation quite quickly, I think, and get the expectations leveling. What are the decision-making rights as part of that? The integration philosophy, a crucial topic. Sometimes that's based on the strategy up front, but how are we actually going to run this integration to deliver on the investment thesis? Is it light touch for the first 6 months? Is it going to be heavy duty after that? Is it just financial systems that we're all going to move on to? What's that philosophy? Is it study and learn their culture before we do anything else, etc.? The roadmap and teams, well, that's part of that vision that you can build as a joint team. And if you don't do it before the transaction, you better have that roadmap very well ready and primed, as well as the teams. You don't want to start picking those teams 5 minutes before the game kicks off. And that's both your internal teams as well as your external teams. It takes time to find each other. How are we going to engage with all these constituencies? What do they need to hear from us at key points? What are their worries, their concerns, etc.? The target operating model, a whole new topic. And then on the right-hand side, the benefits realization, that run sheet I spoke about, all the programmatics, how are we going to coordinate this? How are we going to make sure that the checks and balances are in place through the PMO or the Transaction Management Office? All of the plethora of things you've got to do in the legal regulatory stuff. Your investment bankers will advise you on that. Your lawyers will advise you, but, don't undercook that. And, of course, in the detailed planning. Given, of course, that this is never a perfect science. So, plans are imperfect, but planning is invaluable. So you've got to be able to improvise. All right. So I think that's kind of what's there. You've got to think about all that paraphernalia that needs to be prepared. And then that leads into this sort of penultimate topic, Sean, which is this is an organizational capability. The good news about transactions, despite the failure rates, is that serial acquirers do far better. Those that start small, they experiment, they learn, they study what they did well, study what they did poorly, they improve the team, they improve the process, they get that match fitness. They don't run on for the big international game without having, played a whole lot of junior league games first and having a team that's match fit. And it's very clear. The statistics show when you start small, you build, you learn, you build that match fitness, you do far better, unsurprisingly. It's called programmatic M&A or M&A capability. So just to wrap it up, Sean, on this one, there are a whole lot of things like any organizational capability. If you want to become a regular acquirer, not one that does it once every blue moon, there's lots of dangers around doing it once in every 5 years because the team's moved on, the lessons have been forgotten or ignored. But if you're going to be a serial acquirer or somebody who does this once a year, then you've got to invest in that capability. And there are a whole bunch of things you've got to then work through around, these elements that are called out in the diagram. Sorry, Sean, you were trying to make a point?
Just Hugh, I thought, Hugh, you'd have a comment on this.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I agree with Dean. We've done 80 platform transactions here. We've done over 300 acquisitions. They going back to your price side, they're very complex. They're very long. You need the independence. But, so for us, yes, we are a serial acquirer, but we still use external. We're still very strong on independence, internally testing at each level. And then externally, we use we use a lot of advisors. We use accounting advisors, legal, often commercial in a new sector, which we're trying to really understand. If it's a new capability, we're trying to, even if it's a bolt-on, we may well do commercial diligence, environmental, technical, ESG. So we'll use external advisors extensively just to help, specialist knowledge areas we are not 100% confident on to make sure that we don't make mistakes.
Yeah. Just coming back to a point I think that Hugh had made earlier, if you've got a really good team that's match fit, that understand how to play together, that have got the skills and experience, you're at least halfway there. A great process is never going to save you from incompetent people. A great set of advisors is never going to help if you've got the wrong attitudes and the wrong beliefs amongst the leadership team. But that's why I've particularly called out from my experience, the behaviors, the mindset, the skills and experience. Those are critical things. All right. And then this last one, the words are deliberate. As board members, and we all know how hard it is to be a board member and the pressures you experience, and you don't have the time to immerse yourself deeply into transactions, never mind the day-to-day running of what you need to do as governors. But you need to have justifiable confidence, not just confidence, not blind faith, but justifiable confidence. So you've got to prod and poke and ask those difficult questions, starting with the strategy up front. And these are just a generic sort of vanilla questions. You're going to have to get far more specific, and you can read those yourselves. The level of shareholder value, what is the primary purpose? Why are we really doing this? Is it about cost? Is it about scope of business? Is it about acquiring new skills, etc.? And the evaluation criteria. And here's some quotable quotes from some of the conversations I've had with board members and CEOs. Then it's during the transact or terminate stage. The best decision sometimes, as Hugh said, is just to say, sorry, this isn't going to work. Here's why, we're stepping away. So, again, a set of sort of litmus test questions you really need to ask. Like that second last one, have we really thought through what could go wrong? Have you done the counterfactual? Have you done the pre-mortem? Have you modeled all the sensitivities? Have you built adequate contingency? Cost of capital goes up. Synergies come later. Costs of synergies are half of what we thought, etc. This is the transition stage, which is, you've now, the deal has gone live and you're in the first 100 days. That's what's typically called the transition stage. Do the plans look like we can trust them? Are they well resourced? Are we clear on what success looks like? How will we know whether we're on track or off track? There's that halfway down is a point that Steve made. What are the key beliefs, assumptions, and unknowns? Are we clear on them? Are we monitoring them? The accountability, etc. And then the transform stage. This is where the board keeps stitching back, etc. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. As I say, it's fairly vanilla, but there's merit to this. The one thing I will say about culture is one of the directors I've interviewed when I was doing my research is a sort of maybe one of the most preeminent chairs in Australia, and he said to me, the thing about culture is we say the words, but we don't understand it. And he said, the consideration of culture needs to be deep, detailed, and disciplined. And he said, in my experience, it rarely is. So there we go.
Now, Dean, we have one question from Chris here. Are there any additional or different elements a board needs to consider in a non-for-profit setting?
Well, yes, probably. I mean, you will give a different weight to your stakeholders, to your members, to your clients. I mean, I'm on the board of a major not-for-profit that's involved in mental health. And certainly, as you're going into that transaction, you're not only thinking deeply about your staff, but you're thinking about your clients and their clients. The second thing that you have to give weight to is the boards themselves. In my experience, I always say the great thing about not-for-profits is that the board directors are committed and passionate. The bad thing is that they're committed and passionate. And thinking about your board members themselves, how vested they are, how willing they are to let go of something that they might have been part of because their child had this ailment or, a brother had died from this, etc. You're dealing with deep commitment. And that makes it much harder to navigate. Listed and unlisted company directors tend to be more flexible sometimes about their approaches. And so the board dimension, as well as the client dimension, I think gets a much greater weighting in my view. But, Steve will have some perspectives, no doubt, as well.
Yeah, look, there's a couple of things I think in there with not-for-profits, and that is that they typically don't have the skill set to start with in this area, only because they've never had to do it before, and it might come out of the blue or they're forced to. And so actually having the board and the senior executive understand what the process of this is. And we've found, and the ones we've been involved in, is that the notion of a term sheet is like an eye-opener for most directors, where they say, here are the terms. And the two ones that get them the most are, do we test the market for a new CEO, or do we agree amongst ourselves who it's going to be beforehand? Because we know that the one guarantee of a merger not working is if the CEOs aren't agreeing on who's going to be CEO or the process going forward. And that gets incredibly messy. The other one that's missing from most non-profit mergers that we've come across is the notion of a break fee. So, if one of the others, because of their directors or whatever, have decided, okay, well, we're not going to go ahead with this, then there should be some sort of, after signing the term sheet and they break the term sheet, there should be some sort of incentive for not to break the term sheet. So they're the things that are alien to the not-for-profit sector, but are really, really very useful when they're brought in.
How about you, Hugh? You got a view on that?
Oh, I'm on a couple of not-for-profits, and I'm smiling because, here at the kaupapa, there's so many more different, with a for-profit business, you pretty much align yourselves around capitalism, and you're in it to do right for your employees and the people, but ultimately to make profit. In a not-for-profit, there's more stakeholders, and there's more diverse interests, and there's a wider range of people around the table. The boards tend to be bigger in my experience, and therefore diversity of view, it's a whole different beast. It's good on you, Steve. We'll let you. That's a high level of complexity in my view.
All right. Now, Dean, you wanted me to launch a poll at this stage. Are you happy for me to do that?
I'd be delighted. Thank you, Sean.
Okay. Well, here it is coming up. You could all take just a couple of minutes to put your mark down there.
And what are we doing with the poll results, Sean?
We will be publishing these after the webinar itself.
Perfect.
Just another minute.
That third from the bottom, independent strategic commercial due diligence. Obviously, that's internal for internal digestion. It's not to be shared externally, but that's what we mean by internal only. Whereas some readiness statements, you've got target statements and bidder statements. Those are public.
Okay. So we're almost at the end of our webinar today, gents. Please feel free to connect with any of the gentlemen today on LinkedIn. Their details are on the screen here. I'm sure they will really look forward to your connection. If you'd like to be put in touch with any of them, please indicate your interest on the survey at the end of the webinar as you exit. Our next webinar coming up on August 10th is why a good board needs a solid connection with the CEO. That is a very, very popular webinar. This is the second time we've run that one. So we're really looking forward to that particular one. Now, just as you leave the webinar, don't forget to complete our 1-minute survey and then follow us on LinkedIn to enter the draw for our gift box worth over $500. We'll announce the winner later this afternoon. Thanks again for your attendance today. I hope you really enjoyed the session with the gentleman in front of us. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on August 8th for why a good board needs a solid connection with the CEO. So thank you, Dean Blomson. Thank you, Steve Bowman, Hugh Cottrell. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time today. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.